And here we go. I'm gonna continue my little project, so I'm not gonna waste your time and blabber on, but I'm just gonna remix these Megaman levels and the music to them. But right now, I'm just gonna do the levels. Gonna do it in Blender. So, as you can see on screen, I'm doing Slash Man stage from Mega Man 7. And again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's completely fine. But just sit back, relax, and basically just listen to some SCP stories, some spooky stories with me as I shut up and blend away at this. I learned a cool little technique here, but I don't need to waste your time anymore about it. You'll just see what I'm doing. So, that being said, enjoy.
Blackwood, astronaut. Legendary explorer and naturalist Lord Theodore Blackwood has been around the world, as well as to alternate dimensions, so it makes perfect sense that he would travel among the stars sooner or later. Outer space is no picnic, however, even for one as experienced as Blackwood, and the following tale is a harrowing story of an inhospitable world and hostile alien life. As a side note, as of this recording, this is the fourth and final Blackwood tale in the style of a journal. Hopefully, in the future, other authors will pick up the mantle and further elaborate on his great adventures. But for now, enjoy this final tale. April 3rd, 1856. My succor has arrived. For over a year now, I have been in London, exercising my duties in the House of Lords to aid Mr. Palmerston's government in bringing about the conclusion of the war in the Crimea. Those who have read these pages are well aware, I am certain, that I do not relish government office. The endless meetings and floor sessions and meandering speeches by whips and crossbenchers and the Lords Spiritual could drive a man to madness, and represent nothing less than utter tedium to a man as afflicted by wanderlust as I. Still, with privilege comes responsibility, and when country and party call, it is my duty to don my robe, cast my vote, and maintain the proud heritage of the House of Blackwood as defenders of the Church and the State. With the Russians acquiescing to the treaty that has been signed in Paris this past Sunday, the war has ended, and so has the necessity of my sitting in Parliament. No sooner had I returned to my London estate after the final meeting, when Deeds informed me a caller had visited in my absence. Dr. Hightower, the astronomer, has requested that I meet him 2 nights from now at Greenwich for a demonstration and the discussion of a most interesting proposition. I have not heard from Dr. Hightower since our trip to Mars in 1843. If the news he has in mind to share with me is as elucidating as it was in the days leading to that adventure, then this shall be a welcome change from the quiet desperation in which I have suffered this past year. April 6th, 1856. It has been many years, dear reader, since I was a man young enough to stay awake all night and feel no worse for it the following day. Of course, the nature of the occupation requires that an astronomer keep odd hours, and so it was half before midnight last night when I met Dr. Hightower at the Royal Greenwich Observatory. Dr. Hightower was most excited to see me. For a man who is typically most dour and sedate, concerning himself with the abstractions of physical science, he was uncharacteristically exuberant. He spoke to me of great discoveries and unique opportunities as he ushered me upstairs to the observing chamber, where the facility's great telescope laid bare the heavens to man's prying eye. For several years, Dr. Hightower informed me, he had been busily engaged in making refinements to the telescope that allowed it to compensate for the interfering effects of our atmosphere, allowing him to observe the heavenly bodies in levels of detail never before imagined. The doctor seated me before the great device and bade me to look into the eyepiece of the telescope, which he had delicately adjusted to expose his great discovery. I beheld, amidst the blackness of space, a massive rock, one of the many asteroids that Mr. Piazzi and his associates had discovered between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter in recent years. But unlike the copper plate daguerreotypes that had been published in the Times, this was no barren rock adrift in the void. Save for a few tiny blotches, the entirety of the oblong body was coated in a sea of verdant greenery, the unmistakable color of the virgin jungle. I fancied I could even see the leaves of the canopy that enveloped the miniature world, and at its pole I espied what resembled a palm tree, truly gargantuan in size, towering above the foliage of the world. This was a most interesting discovery indeed. While the famous canals of Mars had proven to be more illusions when I visited them, and its atmosphere I found most unpleasant to breathe, here was proof, plain to see, that God, in his wisdom, had not set living things on our celestial sphere alone, but that the galaxy itself had been seeded with the germ of life. Dr. Hightower had first discovered the asteroid, which he had named Victoria, in honor of our dear Queen, 5 years ago during the mania following Mr. Leverrier's discovery of the planet Neptune several years before. He had kept his discovery secret, he told me, for he had a plan to announce its existence in a manner as grandiose as no astronomer has ever done. For 4 years, at his estate in Wales, Dr. Hightower has employed a team of men constructing a rocket similar to the one proposed by Mr. de Bergerac 2 centuries ago, larger and sturdier than the one that carried us to Mars on our previous voyage. Last week, the final preparations had been made, and the rocket now stood, fueled and ready, to escape the bonds of gravity and carry to Victoria a scientific expedition that will rival Mr. Darwin's. The astronauts will, for several months, have time to catalog and sample the flora and fauna of Victoria, and for the first time since the discovery of Australia, return bearing knowledge of a new world and cement the names of those explorers in the annals of history. For months, Dr. Hightower has been assembling a crew to conduct this expedition. He has pilots, cooks, archivists, writers, daguerreotypists, painters, men-at-arms, and laborers, he told me. But he wants for one thing, a naturalist to manage the exploration and scientific observation of this foreign planet. And of all the men of learning he has known, he could think of no better individual than I to play this part. How could I refuse? Today I have been busy taking stock of what I shall need. We set off for Victoria on the 21st, when our world shall draw the closest to Victoria that it shall be in the next 30 years. And if luck and providence provide, we shall return by Guy Fawkes night. It is rare that I have ventured so far from our land of hope and glory, but England shall have to endure in my absence for a time. April 23rd, 1856. No matter how many times I am among the stars, I shall never grow accustomed to the sensation of weightlessness. One must learn anew how to perform the simplest tasks in this environment, as if returning to infancy. How to move about, how to eat and drink, how to sleep, even how to engage the water closet. For absent the caress of gravity, the slightest unintended twitch can send one hurtling every which way, and the slightest loose drop of moisture applied to our rocket's apparati could spell disaster. This morning, our vessel conducted a circuit of the moon. Dr. Hightower explained to me that we shall use our closest neighbor's gravitational field to produce an effect not unlike a slingshot, granting acceleration that shall enable us to reach Victoria months before we might reach it otherwise. To achieve our target, we must travel twice as far through the blackness of space as the distance that stands between our Earth and the Sun itself. Thus far, Dr. Hightower assures me, all has gone in accordance with plan, and we should reach Victoria by the 1st of July. We took advantage of our approach to the moon to make as many observations as we could. We took several daguerreotypes from the onboard telescopes, and the artists have produced depictions of the dark side, which Dr. Hightower informs me are the first ever made by man. I am told that the surface of the moon is an inhospitable place, wanting entirely for air to breathe, that a vacuum suit would be necessary to stand upon its surface, and that it will likely be 100 years or more before such a deed is feasible. Still, I would very much like someday to attempt it. May 24th, 1856. Today is the Queen's birthday, and beside that, today marks the point where we are officially halfway to the world named for her. In her honor, we held a party in the rocket's cafeteria. There has been little time for frivolity on this voyage thus far. All 63 of us have our appointed tasks to conduct every day, for our rocket is one of the most complex and intricate devices that man has ever engaged, and we are surrounded on all sides by millions of miles of emptiness, from which no salvation will come if we are remiss in our duties. Dr. Hightower toasted the Queen as we sipped the precious rations of champagne he had stowed for specifically this occasion, and I offered a toast to science and to the progress of our empire. I wonder, what would Her Majesty say on this occasion if she knew that Englishmen were praising her name 90 million miles away? I spent a good deal of time contemplating this as I stared out a porthole into the darkness, the stars holding steady in the distance as we hurtled through the cosmos at a greater velocity than man has ever imagined. One truly feels small in these expanses. How insignificant is a man, how great is the mind of God, that in 1,000 lifetimes one could not hope to cross from one end of the universe to another. June 30th, 1856. Today we entered into Victoria's orbit. The artists and photographers have been busy at the portholes and telescopes, creating the first records of this unexplored Eden. I was barely able to manage a peek for a few moments before giving up my spot, and I found myself utterly rapt at the sights that laid before me. What Dr. Hightower had shown me in the telescope at Greenwich was no illusion. The surface of the asteroid, now scarcely a dozen miles beneath my feet, was indeed blanketed thick with foliage, and I even fancied briefly that I espied a bird fluttering amongst the canopy. Tomorrow, almost all of us shall board the landing craft and embark for the surface itself, the handful of pilots remaining aboard the rocket to maintain its orbit, while we catalogue Victoria's wonders for the next 2 months. Dr. Hightower has selected a landing zone at the edge of one of the cratered regions, where there is a break in the foliage large enough to attempt a landing without fear of being obstructed by the flora. I feel as Mr. Columbus must have felt when he espied the tawny, savage people of San Salvador through his spyglass. We are on the cusp of revelation of the sort that happens but once in a lifetime. For tomorrow, I, Theodore Thomas Blackwood, explorer and gentleman, shall set my foot upon the virgin soil of a new world. July 1st, 1856. O glorious day! It was barely 5:30, London time, when our landing craft separated from the main rocket and made its way towards the surface of Victoria. The pressure of re-entry was almost unbearable, and flames licked the windows of the craft as we descended. It was dark outside the craft when we finally impacted the edge of the crater. Victoria is of such small size, Dr. Hightower explained, and of such an irregular shape, that it takes little more than 4 hours for it to complete a single rotation. Day and night are brief affairs. One can almost watch the sun, from this vantage a dim and distant orb no larger than the moon, race across the purplish sky from when it rises in the north until it sinks in the south. Because Victoria is so minuscule in relation to the Earth, Dr. Hightower had warned us that we would weigh but a tiny fraction of what we do there. Perhaps it was simply because I had become so used to weightlessness in the past 2 months, but I feel no lighter here than I ever have. Shortly after we made landfall, Dr. Hightower addressed us with a matter most grave. We know not, he said, whether the environmental conditions of Victoria are conducive to human life. It is entirely possible that the air of this world is unbreathable, or that its flora exude compounds poisonous to man, or that vicious beasts stood ready to tear a man apart, or that the air itself was lousy with bacteria that would kill a man slowly from the inside. It would be necessary, he said, for a single man to expose himself to Victoria before the rest of the expedition alighted, and by his fate demonstrate whether it was safe for man to even exist on this world. It was entirely possible that that man might die, and that his death might be most slow and uncomfortable, but such a sacrifice, if it had to be made, might save 56 other lives. No man would be forced to make this sacrifice, Dr. Hightower said. He sought only a man who was willing to risk his life in the name of science. I immediately volunteered myself as a guinea pig. Dr. Hightower at first objected. I was too critical to the mission, he said, to risk my life so frivolously. I put forth the proposition that as a peer of the realm and a gentleman, I have an obligation to, as it were, lead from the fore, and that I would never dream of putting any man under my authority into a position of hazard that I was not myself willing to occupy. If Victoria was too toxic for man to explore her wonders, I argued, then there could be no further expedition to begin with, and therefore, if I died in ascertaining its safety, there was nothing lost. The men were in solid agreement with this logic, and Dr. Hightower acquiesced. Shortly before 11 in the morning London time, as the sun arose over the crater's edge, I stood alone, in my finest khakis, boots, and helmet, in the landing craft's airlock. The hatch opened and I breathed my first breath of Victorian air. It was hot and thick, more severe even than the oppression of the Amazonian jungle, with a bitter scent not unlike cinnamon. I breathed deeply, and though it was a most laborious effect, I found it not as hostile as the choking air of Mars, nor as cruel and unyielding as the sparse atmosphere of the Himalayas. Though I stood bare and exposed on a world where man had never before dwelled, I lived. Cautiously, I made my way down the gantry and set my foot upon the earth, the treads in my boot impressing themselves in the virgin soil. How small a step for a man, how great a leap for the empire. The earth before me was barren and plain. Less than a mile distant, I beheld the forest that blanketed Victoria. Like a brick wall, it seemed to stand impenetrable, jutting hundreds of feet above the surface. The purple sky was a sharp contrast to the greenery, a vision worthy of one of the great French Impressionists. I lack the words to truly describe the sight and the emotions that ran through me as I beheld that alien landscape, and I wondered if a poet ought to have descended in my stead. With as much solemnity as I could muster, I produced from my jacket a Union flag, mounted to a small pole, and reverentially mounted it in the earth. As the men watched eagerly from the windows of the crowded vessel, I fell to my knees in the Victorian soil and made an address, heard but by God, that I had written and revised in my mind for hours since. I, Theodore Thomas Blackwood, CBE, 7th Viscount of Winchester, do hereby claim in perpetuity this land, the planet Victoria, in the name of Her Majesty the Queen Victoria and of her British Empire, on this, the 1st day of July, in the year of our Lord 1856, and do hereby pray to our Lord and Savior that our expedition to this land shall be fruitful and pleasing unto him. God save the Queen. I remained alone on the surface of the planet for several hours, an entire Victorian sunrise and sunset occurring in the meanwhile, as I took samples of the soil and documented in my journal the conditions of that world. By the time the sun rose again at 3:30, and the rest of the crew could see that I was alive and well, they began to alight as well. We established our base camp at the edge of the forest, which seemed to terminate at a certain point, as if a line had been drawn in the sand, and no plant dared extend its roots further. Tomorrow we shall begin our journey into the forest proper, and endeavor to learn what we can of this planet. July 3rd, 1856. I once thought, dear reader, that I had beheld all there was that a man could hope to see in creation. I have wandered the jungles of South America, and blazed trails across the frontiers of the West. I have lived among the unknown cults of India and Bangladesh. I have trekked across the great outback, wandered the vast and empty forests of Siberia, and led men and dogs across the vast plateaus of Antarctica. So I had thought until this day. Were I to make a comparison, I would say that the Victorian forest is most like that of the rainforests of Brazil. Beneath the massive trees, little of the already sparse sunlight reaches, and were it not for our electric torches, we would be altogether blind. The undergrowth is thick and impassable, and we have had to make liberal use of our machetes to cut a path into the forest. Dr. Hightower's thermometer attests that the temperature, day or night, is almost a constant 130 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than all but the most desolate of the Arabian wastelands. The flora here must derive their nutrition from the heat of the air, for no terrestrial plant could hope to blossom in an environment this dim. Already we have collected several hundred samples of organisms unlike none that have been seen on Earth. I imagine that Oxford itself will be set on its ear for decades in endeavoring to decrypt the nature of these organisms once we announce our findings. To our universal surprise and delight, we have discovered this day that there is not only foliage, but that animal life exists on Victoria as well. Four-winged creatures not unlike insects flit through the air, alighting from flower to flower in the vines that crisscross the jungle. From mounds on the earth teem thousands upon thousands of creatures that for all the world are dead ringers for the common ants one may find anywhere on Earth. We collected many samples of the insect life. The ants, however, responded with great hostility when we attempted to examine them. Mr. Andrews, one of the junior biologists in the mission, was suddenly set upon by thousands of the creatures when he attempted to examine their nest, and found himself suffering a toxic condition as the result of their bite. As we have yet to encounter any megafauna, I am beginning to suspect that the ants are the dominant organism of this world. I have often felt a curious rhythm emanating from the earth whenever I approach their nests, and I suspect that some subterranean machinery may be to account. July 11th, 1856. Today our expedition reached the base of the giant tree at Victoria's Pole. It has been less than 10 miles from the landing site to the tree's base. The jungle, however, has proven so thick that cutting our way through the thick vines has proven a full-time occupation for many of the men. We have observed yet no larger animals than the dragonflies of this world. As thick as the various and entangled vines of the flora are, I doubt that any larger animals could even evolve here. We have named this great tree the Major Oak, in reference to that ancient tree in Sherwood, where Robin Hood and his band of outlaws held court. It is indeed, as I first considered it from telescope, very similar to the rare palms that grow along the tropical coast. But unlike those plants, it is truly massive. It stands some 400 feet tall, and 7 of the men with their arms outstretched were barely able to encircle it. I have taken several core samples from the Major Oak, and would have willingly climbed her myself to acquire a sample of her fronds. But I am not the young man that I once was, and it was decided that Mr. Edelman, a junior biologist late of Cambridge, would perform that obligation. I watched in stunned silence with the men as he shimmied up that massive trunk, which must have taken millennia to become what it is today, and saluted us with a single thumb cast skyward as he reached the top of that organism. As I sit here writing in my tent at the base of the Major Oak, I find it impossible to believe that we have made such incredible breakthroughs in so many days. What will they say, I wonder, when we return to Earth, and the proof of our exploration is published, plain for the world to see, in every periodical from San Francisco to Peking? Perhaps I shall finally earn the knighthood that I long have coveted. But no temporal honor is greater than the knowledge that the progress of science and reason, and of the glory of the British Empire, has been advanced by my efforts. July 27th, 1856. A most terrible calamity has befallen us this day. 6:30 in the morning, at the second sunrise of the day, we heard a strange sound in the distance. A droning sound, barely liminal at first, that slowly grew louder and more ominous. It seemed to come from the direction of the sunrise. Mr. Andrews held his binoculars to the horizon and espied a terrible doom, a swarm of insects, not unlike the common locust, voraciously devouring everything in its path and moving with great speed toward our base camp. We have not yet seen this type of swarming behavior from the Victorian fauna, and in any event we had little time to study it, for in 15 minutes they descended upon us. We scrambled to move as much equipment into the landing craft as we could, but what we left behind, the creatures devoured or destroyed. Poor Mr. Jacobs did not make it to the airlock in time, and I watched in horror as hundreds of the insects enveloped him and stripped him to the bone in seconds. Minutes later, the swarm was gone, and we emerged to survey the destruction. We are fortunate to have lost little of our research. However, we have lost many of our tents, and a good deal of food and fresh water. Worst of all, the engines of the landing craft themselves have been compromised. Mr. Darren, the pilot, says we cannot now take off to rejoin our rocket in orbit, and it shall have to be repaired if we are to have any hope of ever leaving this world. For now, my work continues as it has. Many of the men have been assigned to rebuild the engines. The rest of us shall continue to study and observe, and pray for their success. Dr. Hightower says that the rocket must begin its return to Earth no later than the 1st of November, lest the distance between our worlds become so great that the trip would be years in the taking. The doctor is confident that the engines can be repaired, and that we should be homeward bound by September. A more immediate concern, however, is that we now have but 2 weeks worth of food left to us, and with the landing craft out of commission, there is no way to bring more from the rocket, or even alert them to our distress. The water that flows in creeks and rivulets upon this world, and dribbles from the trees like morning dew, has proven safe to drink. But if we are to endure on Victoria until summer's end, we shall have to determine which of the native organisms are safe to eat. Note to the reader. At Mr. Blackwood's request, I have heavily revised and edited the following 2 entries in this journal. As Mr. Blackwood had at the time come under the unfortunate effects of consuming Victoria's native flora, he was not of sound mind when he wrote these pages. The following entries contain numerous errors in spelling and standardized sentence structure, rambling and incoherent tangents of an incomprehensible nature, and several vulgarities which Mr. Blackwood is not proud of. And partway through the second entry, he had abandoned the English language entirely and began to write in Chinese. I have translated and standardized the spelling throughout, and expunged those portions which Mr. Blackwood has asked me to omit. I have done my best to maintain his genteel and scholarly tone, and to describe the state of mind he was in at the time. I hope the reader will not feel that I have taken any undue liberties. Deeds, being of smokeless fire. August 16th, 1856. It is difficult to write at this time. Though the affliction I suffer is less severe than many of the men, I find my mind clouded and confused, and it is a Herculean effort to keep my thoughts clear enough to express. We spent several days in experimentation with the native foodstuffs. Several of the vines and fruits were poisonous, and 5 of the men died most uncomfortable deaths. We eventually discovered several of the larger vines bear sweet and savory vegetables that could be eaten and digested without discomfort, and were indeed not unpleasant in taste. We feasted liberally that night, though at Dr. Hightower's request, the men working on the engines were to abstain, for fear of a long-term effect that might impair their critical work. His judgment may yet save us all. Several days after we began eating the native food, we began to turn green. It was a minor pallor at first, like that of a jaundiced man, but with time it grew more severe. Some of the men who have eaten the most are almost the same color as the trees themselves. The coloring itself seemed to bear no more malicious effects along with it, however. Dr. Hightower assured us it was safe to continue eating, but I voluntarily cut my rations at that time. I have been eating only sparingly the last 2 weeks, and have lost a considerable amount of weight. A few days after that, the men began going mad. At first they complained of having difficulty in cognition, as I now do myself, and claimed hallucinations. Later they began speaking in nonsense entirely. Several of them seemed to sit for hours and have conversations in utter gibberish. A few have taken to frolicking naked amongst the trees and rolling in the dirt, referring to the plants as their sisters, and attempting to court them as if they were eligible ladies. Dr. Hightower has been spending his time by the largest ant hills. He claims the ants are heathens, and that he intends to convince them of the righteousness of Christianity. He sits for hours with his ear to the ground, the ants crawling around and over him, reading aloud from the New Testament. As I write, he is currently on the 17th chapter of Acts. Curiously enough, I had always understood Dr. Hightower to be of the Jewish faith. I pray the engineers have our vessel repaired soon, for I fear the men may be beyond saving if we remain here much longer. I had to shoot 2 of the men yesterday. They had come to the determination that our landing craft was a great metallic devil and had to be slain, and were attempting to chew their way through the wires of an instrument panel. We are almost out of terrestrial food. The engineers may have to begin eating Victorian foliage in a day or 2, and choose between madness or starvation. Either way, we are surely doomed. We came to Victoria to explore in peace. Instead, we may remain here to rest in peace. September 8th, 1856. Dr. Hightower's madness may have saved us after all. I awoke from a stupor this afternoon, having collapsed in a stream by our base camp, only to find myself in the air, being carried by a blanket of ants. I looked up and saw that ants were swarming over what remained of our camp by the millions, streams of them coming from every which direction, and making their way to our ship. I feared that they intended to finish the job the locusts had begun, but not one of the men made any sound of distress, and I found that I had not a single bite upon me. The ants were carrying men by the dozens and loading them into our lander, and carrying other objects as well, great hunks of metal and tools the likes of which I have never beheld before. They crawled in and out of the damaged engines. By God, they were repairing them. In less than 2 hours, Mr. Gregory, the engineer, a man now emaciated and half-starved for want of food, reported that the engines had come alive and our escape was possible. Not all of the men were aboard, but we saw no sign of the others. Either they have perished, or run off into the forest in utter madness. In any event, those of us of sound enough mind voted and decided we could not spare another day to search for them. We have been given an opportunity, and we must make use of it. I caught a final glimpse of the Union flag I had planted in the soil in July as we lifted off. The 26 of us that were left, abandoning the mad planet Victoria for the last time. December 12th, 1856. The journey back home was a long and arduous one, but I have never felt so relieved to be back in London as I was when Deeds greeted me at the door with a nip of brandy and my favorite silk pajamas. With as few of us in possession of our faculties as there were at the outset, it was nearly impossible to operate the rocket safely. Many of us did not sleep for days. Fortunately, once liberated from the planet and its madness-inducing flora, the men began to recover their senses, and our flesh acquired once again a healthy shade. Most of the men remember little of the time they were under the influence of those horrid crops. Dr. Hightower, I fear, may not recover fully. He is lucid, indeed, but he lacks the sharp mind and cleverness he once had, and shall be retiring to the country. When I spoke to him the day before last, we agreed for now that it is best not to publish our full findings on Victoria. Any attempt to colonize that land will surely end in disaster, and if the culture of the ants is as advanced and sophisticated as it seems, they could oppress and conquer our empire as easily as the rebellions in India and Zululand of late have been put down. I shall keep the samples and notes we acquired in my country estate for safekeeping. Perhaps in a few decades, when we better understand the chemistry of those organisms, another adventure might be advisable. Deeds was seen to the cleaning and mending of the clothes I had brought on that ill-fated expedition today, when he informed me that several live ants had crawled out a pocket and escaped through a crack in the wall. It is entirely possible they were nothing more than ordinary insects, but I wonder, after so many of the Victorian ants crawled over and through our ship, repairing our systems, how many stowaways might we have brought back with us? SCP-3300. The Rain. Rain can have a variety of effects on people and places. A little rain while outside can be annoying, while listening to a little rain while inside can be relaxing. A lot of rain can result in damage and loss of life, while too little rain for too long can have a similar effect. Most commonly, though, rain represents dreariness and sadness, but also symbolizes life and rebirth, which altogether brings us to SCP-3300. 3300 isn't a world-ending threat or a dark piece of horror, but it is a sad little story about the residents of an anomalous town. SCP-3300 is an event that occurs every year in the town of Clearwater, Montana, typically in June, and lasts for 6 to 18 days, the first 48 hours of which consist of a light, continuous rain over the town. This rain occurs regardless of the weather in the surrounding area. After 48 hours, the light rain transitions to a severe thunderstorm, which lasts until the event is over. Notably, the town has never been observed by the Foundation during a 3300 event. Any attempt by the Foundation to enter during an event results in the total loss of personnel and equipment, or a failure to even enter the anomaly, as personnel walk in and suddenly emerge on the other side of the town. After the event finishes, every citizen of the town is gone, and has been replaced with a new set of citizens, with different appearances, personalities, and memories. These new citizens will remark on the severity of the recent storm, but otherwise will show no recollection of the anomalous event and replacement. Residents of the town behave identically to normal human beings, but no record of any of them exists prior to each 3300 event. Additionally, no resident is ever a match for a prior resident of the town, although they will occasionally repeat names, professions, certain memories, and broad personality traits. If a resident of Clearwater is outside of the town when a 3300 event occurs, they will disappear a few days later, although any attempts to observe this disappearance will ultimately fail. Aside from all that, the residents seem to be normal human beings, none of them possessing any physical or mental abnormalities, and they don't seem to have any knowledge of the 3300 event and their strange existence. There's also a secondary effect associated with 3300, similar to a mild anti-memetic effect. Anyone outside of Clearwater that learns about the town or its citizens will quickly lose focus on the subject unless it's again brought to their direct attention. People don't forget about the town, they just have difficulty paying attention to it, even if they personally know someone that disappeared from Clearwater. This effect has likely contributed to the Foundation's overall lack of information on 3300, as despite records of it going back to the beginning of the Foundation, little information has been gleaned about it. The biggest source of information the Foundation has on Clearwater and 3300 is a handwritten journal recovered after a 3300 event that ended on June 30th, 1995. The writer has been identified as a young woman named Margaret Lane, and it contains a rare description of what goes on inside of the town during an event. Based on the intro to the journal, it seems that Margaret has had a rough past, possibly with drug use. Margaret writes that it might be nice to have something to look back on, hopefully to remind her that things get better. She moves on to describing a recurring dream she's been having, in which she's not herself, but she's in a small hut, standing above her daughter in a bed. Her daughter is ill, with red, blotchy skin, and she prays in the dream that the disease won't take her. It seems whoever she is in the dream had a husband who succumbed to the disease, so she knows what will happen to her daughter. Another healthy person, who she refers to as a boy who thinks himself a man, calls everyone together that is still healthy. The boy grins, gestures to a bowl of water in front of him, and says that he has found the key to their salvation. She then always wakes up from the dream at this point, and has no idea what to make of it. She finishes the journal section by writing that there are gray clouds on the horizon, and that they need the rain. When she writes again, it has been drizzling for 3 days, and it doesn't look like it's going to stop soon. Phone lines seem to be failing, and the radio says they can expect the weather to continue for at least a week. She mentions someone named David, who showed up and tried to entice her with some drugs, but she sent him away before her mom noticed. She writes that the rain is kind of relaxing, with a rhythm to it, and that she could get used to it. In the next entry, it seems that the 3300 event has transitioned out of the drizzling phase, as Margaret writes that she doesn't think it's ever stormed this hard in her life. The clouds are thick enough to make it look like midnight in the middle of the day, and her throat is sore from having to constantly shout over the noise. Apparently, the weather instantly flipped one moment from drizzling to drastically storming, and now both the internet and phone lines are down. The only broadcasts they've gotten from the radio have been tornado and flood warning. She finishes the entry by mentioning that she's seen some people walking around outside when the lightning flashes, some of them just standing there. Things really kick off with the next entry, however, as Margaret writes from the back of her friend Jared's van as they speed down a highway. Margaret thinks that she's going to die, and none of them have any idea what's going on. An hour prior, she and a group of friends were at her place playing Dungeons and Dragons. One of them, Isabel, noticed a banging on the door, like someone trying to break it down. They were very suspicious, as it was late, and of course there was a torrential downpour going on, but Jared went to check the peephole. He opened the door to reveal a family of 4 on Margaret's doorstep, none of them familiar to her. For a brief moment, everyone was silent, until the father of this family shoved past Jared and asked why they were in his house. Margaret's mother comes out at this point and begins to swear and yell at the man. The man began to step forward, but was halted for a moment by Jared. The man then proceeded to grab Jared and fling him across the room, causing Jared to smack against a counter and go limp. The man asks again why they are in his house, and Margaret's mother now charges him with a golf club. Things get really weird, however, as she swings the golf club at his chest, and it embeds itself into his flesh. The man appears unfazed by the attack, as his skin ripples and water drips out from where the golf club is stuck. He then proceeded to calmly pull the club from his chest and walk towards Margaret's mother, who was screaming and scrambling away. He then beat her over and over with the club, only continuing to say, my house," in the same tone. The rest of the mysterious family were still in the doorway, watching, and Margaret swears that the wife was smiling. Margaret and her friends fled from the house, grabbing Jared as they did so, and they went straight for the police station. The lights in the station were all on, but the doors were locked and they couldn't see anyone inside. They decided that Jared needed to go to a hospital, so their best bet was a hospital in another town, 2 hours away. 6 hours of driving later, they're almost out of gas, and the next town is nowhere in sight. In fact, practically nothing is in sight, including road signs, gas stations, or even other cars. The storm hasn't let up since, and they don't have enough gas to make it back to Clearwater. Soon, the car runs out of gas, and Jared succumbs to his wounds. The group sits in the car and waits. Margaret then records another dream she had while sleeping in the car. It continues where her last dream left off, as she stands ankle-deep in a vast river, holding the corpse of her daughter. Her daughter is nigh unrecognizable due to the disease, with her hair fallen out and her skin covered in black scabs. For some reason, however, when she looks at her deceased daughter, she feels hope instead of sorrow. She places her daughter in the river, and the body drifts on the surface until the water engulfs it. Her daughter's body becomes a part of the water, and she knows that her daughter will be taken to the sea, where she can be at peace. She then turns and wades back to shore, where she finds the diseased body of her husband and the other survivors. Each survivor is in a similar situation, holding on to the bodies of their children, families, and friends. Each body is taken into the river until only the 18 survivors remain. Margaret wakes up then to the sound of Jared evaporating. Steam fills the car as the group scrambles around Jared's body, and Margaret sees that his corpse is boiling, bubbles writhing and popping across his skin. Drops of water jump off of him, scalding the others, and his body deforms as it boils and evaporates away. The heat was too great for any of them to touch him or try and stop it, so they just watched as he bubbled and fizzles away, leaving behind a pile of soaked clothing. A pretty inexplicable situation, but the group decides that there's no point in staying in the car and waiting to starve, so they head out into the storm. They walk less than a mile before reaching Clearwater, rather surprisingly for the group. They immediately turned around, walked a few miles, and ended up back at Clearwater. They then decided to head in a different direction, through a field. On the other side, it was Clearwater. They were pretty unsettled by the situation, obviously, but figured that whatever was going on in the town was also going on outside of it, and at least the town had food. All of the lights in Clearwater were on, but they couldn't find a single other person, and no cars either. They went to a sporting goods store next to a grocery store, as it had guns, and they began sleeping in shifts. Margaret was on shift with one of her friends, Mike, when he walked off and said he'd be back in a minute. Margaret thought he was going to the bathroom, but she then heard a gunshot. They found Mike's body slumped against a wall with a shotgun barrel in his mouth. Curiously, there was no blood to be seen, but splattered on the wall behind his head was water. As they sat there next to Mike's corpse in shock, one of them eventually reached out and ran her fingers along the wound in the back of his head. Her fingertips were coated in water, causing her to begin reaching into his skull, finding only more water. In a panic, she jumped up and grabbed a nearby knife, running the blade across her arm. Water spilled from the wound. They are then drawn to the windows of the sporting goods store, where they see hundreds of people outside, filling the street and standing in the rain. Margaret doesn't recognize any of them, but they are surrounding the building. Soon, one of Margaret's friends leaves the building, and Margaret reflects that she thought she should have done something to stop her, but couldn't, like the thought process was being blocked. As soon as she was outside, the people shifted to allow her through, and she vanished into the dark. The last thing she said before she left was, "I don't want to go back." Margaret has one last dream, in which she has become the storm. She screams out as wind whips her and the frozen rain bites at her skin, except she doesn't have a body. Every second she rips herself apart and reforms until she is scattered over miles of this storm, trapped. Around her, she hears the screams of the other survivors from her village, each part of the storm as well. They struggle against it, but the storm can't be broken. Eventually, she falls, rushing to meet the ground, and for a moment she is embraced by the earth. She feels dirt beneath her feet, the sun on her skin, and crisp air in her lungs. But then, the storm steals her again, pulling her back into it. Margaret wakes up again, to find herself alone in the sporting goods store. Her last friend is gone, and there is only a puddle on the floor where she was. Margaret writes that she believes the rain is speaking to her, and she doesn't know what it's saying, but it's growing louder. She knows what it wants her to do. It wants her to rejoin it, because she is the storm's child. The strangers are all still outside, watching and waiting. Margaret knows that there's only one way this can end, whether she starves or kills herself or walks outside. She finishes her journal by writing, "The water is eternal. The water will remain no matter how polluted it becomes. At the end, we all become rain. I don't want to go back." If you haven't quite pieced it together, the people of Clearwater are not exactly people in the normal sense. Most of the time, for all intents and purposes, they are, as the Foundation can't find anything anomalous about the citizens themselves. During the 3300 event every year, however, something changes, and every resident of Clearwater dies by being turned back into the water that makes up this anomalous storm. At the same time, this anomalous storm spits out a new set of people who believe that they have lived in Clearwater their entire lives. Thus, the weird family that wondered why these people were in their house. The new set of people aren't really normal either during the event, obviously. But once the event is over, they have no memory of being spit out from the storm. Ultimately, this storm is creating new, functional human beings that believe themselves to be as normal as the rest of us until the next year when their existence comes to a crashing halt. The implication of the dreams, however, is that this storm and the 3300 event is the result of a ritual from some point in the past, when a village attempted to save themselves from some horrendous disease. The villagers did indeed save themselves, in a way, by becoming a part of a storm, but it has resulted in the continual and tragic loss of life, even if you don't consider these people to be real human beings. On the surface, SCP-3300 is about the rain and a weird event in a small town, but in the end, it's more of an existential piece about the inevitability of our passing and the lack of meaning in our lives. Contemplation about the fleeting nature of life can have a variety of effects on a person, from dread to comfort, making it not that dissimilar to rain. Insect Hell. The SCP Foundation has to deal with all sorts of world-ending threats, and they've generally become quite adept at handling them. Sometimes, though, a problem comes along that just slips out of the Foundation's control, and before they know it, they've ushered in a fresh apocalypse. Insects don't typically rank high on the lists of threats to the global population, but too much of anything can be a real problem. This canon depicts a scenario in which a rather unique insect grows completely out of control, leading to a situation that can only be described as insect hell. The insect hell scenario begins with a document from Wilson's Wildlife Solutions, a group sanctioned by the Foundation to assist in containing anything that falls under the wildlife category, from anomalous wolves to spiders. They had stumbled upon a unique Australian plague locust in Oregon that they named Genghis. They found it after its swarm was responsible for a crop shortage, and it was determined that they were growing at an unusually fast rate. Australian plague locusts shouldn't have even been able to survive in the Oregon climate, let alone thrive, but after some tests they discovered why. When Genghis eats enough food, it splits into two locusts, and it's apparently capable of doing this quite often if it's fed enough. Based on their research, they guessed that Genghis had been here for around 13 years, although it wasn't especially active at first. They had been tracking them for a couple of months, eventually getting a call that the swarm was nearby. When they had arrived, though, the swarm had been sprayed with pesticides, and they only managed to save one, Genghis. It's presumed that all of the replicated locusts can also replicate. A Wildlife Solutions member named Carl Heller was placed in charge of Genghis, with it and a few others placed in a greenhouse, and the rest of the current swarm in another greenhouse. All of them are given plenty to eat, allowing them to freely multiply. They also like to allow animals to experience their natural habitat from time to time, so they occasionally drive the swarm out to a field surrounded by a mesh fence, and allow them to roam. When the swarm grows too large, they sell a number of the locusts off to scientific corporations for testing. Unfortunately, on March 6, 2021, Carl Heller was caught in a multiple car crash while driving the swarm out to the field, allowing the swarm to escape containment. The Foundation is contacted to assist in recontainment. This leads the Foundation to quickly classify Genghis as SCP-3916, noting its anomalous traits. For one, it can consume food at an alarming rate, roughly 100 grams of matter per second, although it only has been found to eat fresh plant matter. Secondly is its ability to replicate after consuming a sufficient amount of food, around 500 grams worth. Due to the speed at which it can consume 500 grams, though, this is quite worrisome. The Foundation did manage to track down most of the escaped swarm, but most isn't really good enough in this situation, with the remaining insects spreading rapidly across Oregon and into California. This could very quickly become a broken masquerade scenario in which the public becomes aware of anomalies. So, to give themselves a bit of leeway in their operations, the Foundation began working with the US government. They formed a new organization known as LARPA, Locust Active Removal and Prevention Agency, which is entirely funded and staffed by the Foundation, but is publicly part of the US government. 5 months go by, and the situation isn't looking good. Not only has the Foundation not managed to contain the spread of the locusts, a new subspecies of Genghis has popped up in containment. During a routine examination of the swarm in containment, a researcher was attacked and eaten by the swarm, revealing that the locusts have now progressed to eating both plant matter and animal matter. So far, there have been no instances of the locusts outside of containment eating animal matter, but the situation is growing even more worrisome. On a talk show, America Ahead with Daniel Daly, the locust situation is brought up due to their effect on America's environment and agriculture, and what LARPA is doing to fix it. Michael Simmons, administrator of the LARPA headquarters, and Dr. James Patan, LARPA's lead researcher, are brought on to discuss the situation. Simmons says that LARPA is working to find pesticides that can limit the locusts, and they're working to find a way to make sure this doesn't happen again. As for finding the pesticides, Patan says they have been exposing the locusts to a number of different pesticides, but mostly the results have turned out negative. Daly asks them why these locusts are so resilient, with Patan explaining them as being akin to a different strain of locusts, although their species is still the Australian plague locust. This brings the discussion over to how exactly some Australian plague locusts ended up in the US, with Simmons saying that even 2 locusts were enough to start something like this. Daly questions him on the usage of the word were, but Simmons corrects himself and says could have been. Daly moves on to asking about the estimated impact of LARPA on the environment and the economy. Patan replies that if LARPA does their job, the US won't need to go through with their proposed ration acts, and eventually there will be plenty of jobs in agriculture again. As for dealing with the locust, Simmons plans on exterminating all of them, although Patan disagrees, stating that Simmons is not a doctor. Daly asks if it's ethical to drive a species to intentional extinction, but Simmons says ethics doesn't matter as long as his job is to save human lives. Both Dr. Patan and Daly team up against Simmons, arguing against genocide of the locusts, and Simmons grows angrier, yelling at them that he's not going to stand by and watch as these bugs destroy their way of life. Patan argues that if they wipe out all of the locusts without learning from the situation, they'll just pop back up again, perhaps worse than before. He says that containment is the right answer, but Simmons responds that extermination is the only way, and he'll give every US citizen a flamethrower if that's what it takes. Simmons eventually storms off the set while exclaiming that this is the future of humanity at stake, and they're down to the line. Patan remains behind and explains that Simmons is qualified for his position, he's just under a lot of stress right now, understandably so. He concludes by telling the American people that these few locusts will not be the end of America. The following day, Simmons and Patan discuss the show back at LARPA headquarters. Simmons apologizes for the way he acted, with Patan saying that now America thinks a whack job is running LARPA, and it makes them all look bad. Regardless, Patan says that it'll all be fine, and the situation will be over in a couple of months. Despite Patan's confidence, another 6 months go by. The locusts outside of containment continue to eat only plant matter, which is bad enough, but the ones in containment have continued to evolve. They now seem to eat practically any matter, with the only known exception being silicon-based glass. They seem to prefer fresh organic matter over anything else, but this has necessitated their containment chamber being covered in hardened glass. They are continuing to feed the swarm for research purposes, but kill most of them with fire after they multiply. Fire is their best bet, as the locusts in containment have become highly resistant to any sort of chemical-based attack, likely as a side effect of their ability to consume them. Any conventional chemicals are absolutely useless, and even the special stuff engineered by the Foundation or from other anomalies has proven to be ineffective. Physical force is also out, as they can simply eat through pretty much any weapon used, aside from impractical glass weapons, leaving only intense heat or radiation as their options. If this swarm were to ever be released, they'd make the current wild locusts look like a small problem in comparison. Of course, with a setup like that, you knew that it was bound to happen, and eventually, in July of 2022, the subspecies they had in containment broke out. One day, they mutated and developed the ability to consume glass in addition to every other form of matter, eating through their containment cell. The Foundation's plan for this circumstance was to detonate a nuclear warhead contained at the site in order to wipe them out before they could flee, but Dr. Patan heads through the site to call off the detonation, believing that they can still recontain the locusts inside of the underground site. At the control center, he encounters Simmons, brandishing a gun after having lost most of his right arm to the locusts. Simmons accuses Patan of having purposefully orchestrated the breach in order to get rid of him, as Simmons was apparently planning to remove Patan as lead researcher. Patan doesn't respond to this accusation, instead telling Simmons that they need to disarm the nuke since they can recontain the locusts. Patan tries calling the MTF leader in charge of the locust containment to have him back up the claim, but he doesn't get an answer. In the end, Simmons gives him 30 minutes to try and recontain the situation before he detonates the nuke. Time ticks by, and Patan eventually comes to terms with the idea of detonating the nuke, acknowledging that he had been so invested in being humanity's savior against these locusts that he never slowed down to think if they were doing the right things. While prepping the nuke, they get alerted to a notice that an area of the site had been recontained, and they get a call on the radio from the MTF leader, Captain Quayle. The MTF had managed to push the locusts back and contain them to a small number of sections, although he doesn't know for how long, since they can eat through pretty much anything. Since Patan knows now that they'll never actually recontain the locusts, he still wants to go through with the nuke. Since the site is no longer in Code Red status now, however, the only way they can go through with it is to open all of the doors in the site to bring them back into Code Red status. They evacuate everyone in the site first, and give them all time to drive away. While finishing the prep, they hear an alert that a number of the fire doors in the site have been breached, which were made of glass. Since Patan had apparently orchestrated this containment breach, they hadn't realized until now that the locust could actually eat glass. They initiate the nuke and destroy the entire site. Unbeknownst to them, however, for whatever reason, the captain of the MTF had been driving away in a containment van carrying several of the modified locusts. Before long, the locusts ate through the captain and the entire van, breaching containment and beginning the end of the world. Within the hour, LARPA received a distress call from a nearby town claiming that they were under assault from an unusually aggressive group of locusts, with several people already eaten. By the time Foundation agents arrived, it was a ghost town, and the locusts had moved on. The O5 Council declared it an active end-of-the-world scenario, and by evening, the locust swarm ranged from Oregon to Colorado, with projections pointing that they'll blanket the US within 18 hours, and the world within 48. That's technically where this story ends, with the rest left mostly to our imagination. There is an SCP that seems to be connected to the Insect Hell scenario, however, possibly from an alternate timeline. SCP-4991 is the designation for the period from April 7th, 2016 to April 9th, 2016, when major social networking websites such as Twitter, Reddit, and 4chan all experienced a number of posts that referenced non-existent events. During this period, users were met with errors that hindered their ability to post, although the anomalous posts were all seemingly created by existing accounts. 2 days after its initial manifestation, all anomalous activity suddenly ceased, and the websites restored normal functionality. 4991 was reclassified as neutralized, all evidence of the posts were wiped out, and a viral Class K amnestic was distributed. We're given a sampling of some of the posts made by 4991 during this time, starting with some from Twitter. A post from real Donald Trump mentions that someone named Moore stepped out of an agreement, complaining that when the world is ending, he started to get a bit antsy, and asks if Earth is not good enough for him. A post from Dear College advises that Insect Arcana is not to be attempted for the time being by students, and entrances into Fae-related areas have been closed down for maintenance. The World Health Ministry warns everyone in North America to not go outside, and if you ever breathe outside, to please call poison control. The Twitter account for the musical group BTS sent out a post reading, "I can't breathe," in Korean. Someone else tweeted about Marshall Carter and Dark selling anti-insect bunkers for $4 million, and musician Travis Scott tweeted, "It all ends in tears anyway." Over on Reddit, someone posted asking about the SCP Foundation and their securement plan, with someone else explaining that the plan was an agreement between the US government and the Foundation in order to reduce the number of bugs, requiring the budget from several large nations, as well as around 90% of the Foundation's budget, due to the extreme expenses from the pesticides they planned on using. It seems that a couple of days prior, the O5-1 of the Foundation, Colt Moore, stepped out of the securement plan for reasons unknown, and afterwards, the SCP Foundation entirely disappeared. Everyone associated with the Foundation has vanished, and all of their sites are now completely empty. The bug population increased tenfold in their absence. Someone else posts a picture of a beautiful flock of birds flying over their town, but someone else comments that those aren't birds. Someone on Tumblr posted that the bugs are pretty easy to catch, as they just opened their door and threw out a net, but says not to let them into your mouth, as they love to crawl in there. Others post about holding out in their basement with enough food and water to last at least 6 months, and if you have to go outside for any reason, to cover your mouth. The person that posted about catching the bug later posts a warning to not catch them and to not let them inside. On 4chan, someone posts asking if anyone ever feels like God hates his creations. Well, someone else posts that they just strung up their friend in the woods and cut him open while all the bugs started swarming them. Someone else comments that they had to kill their sister as the bugs got to her, and she started attacking her family with a knife. She killed her father, and the bugs instantly swarmed and ate the corpse. The poster says that there's some mist coming out of the bugs, and they can feel them rubbing on their skin. Someone else posts a picture of a tree covered in insects, with another individual asking them why they're outside, and someone else commenting that ignorance will be the birth and death of humanity. It's hard to say if it's the exact same insect hell scenario, but it's pretty close and pretty horrific. There is one last tale, though, that presents a possible conclusion to the insect hell scenario, one not entirely filled with doom and gloom. It begins with mentioning the events of July 25th, 2022, as the swarm of anomalous locusts escapes from the Foundation facility. 5 months later, an emergency beacon in Idaho didn't receive its daily signal from Site 19, suggesting that no one was left alive there to send out the signal. The beacon then pinged Site 31, but didn't receive a response, nor did it receive one from Sites 84, 119, or 12. It began working its way through all of the 3,547 sites controlled by the Foundation, but didn't receive a single response. 24 hours later, it attempted the same process again, still receiving no response. It proceeded to carry this process out every day for a year before moving on to the next step in its protocol, deactivating its cloaking system and calling for help. It took a long time of calling out and receiving no response before something changed. A woman eventually heard the call and followed it to the beacon, finding a small gray rectangle with a red button on it, which she pushes. The beacon, which contains an AI, is relieved to finally get a response, and quickly asks if the locusts are still out there. The woman, Caroline North, says that she hasn't seen a live one in about half a year, as they died off due to running out of things to eat. The AI tells her that it's a third-generation AI construct built by the SCP Foundation, named Solomon. Solomon proceeds to explain to her what the SCP Foundation was, and how they protected mankind from anomalous threats. Caroline is pretty skeptical, comparing them to the Men in Black, and even though the locusts were pretty different, she doesn't believe that there could be more things like that out there. In order to prove that anomalies exist, Solomon plays a disharmonious series of notes, which causes her to be unable to move her left arm for a minute, explaining it as a cognitohazard. He continues, explaining that a friend of the Foundation's introduced them to some harmless locusts that could eat quickly and breed quickly in March of the previous year. He goes on to mention the researcher that was suddenly devoured by the locusts in containment, but says that containment continued as usual. When they found the locusts eating through their cell, they added glass, which they couldn't eat. He admits that these sudden mutations were possibly the Foundation's fault, as none of the ones outside were mutating. They eventually ate through the glass and breached containment, with not even a nuke stopping the problem. Now the locusts are all gone, but only after consuming practically everything on Earth. Caroline sat and pondered this for a long time, before asking how the Foundation could possibly let this happen. In a rage, she asks why the Foundation wouldn't just exterminate all of the locusts, instead of keeping them in a cage and letting this happen. Solomon simply explains that that wasn't how the Foundation operated, as they secured, contained, and protected not only mankind, but the anomalies as well. They needed to know everything they could from the locusts, as knowledge was their greatest weapon. Obviously, in the end, they were wrong. Solomon apologizes to Caroline on behalf of the Foundation, and says that they could have done better and they should have done better. Caroline says that she had a fiancé, and they were sent into different trucks when the government evacuated their area. After the locust died out, she went looking for him, finding the remains of his truck. There wasn't even any bones left to bury. Solomon apologizes again, acknowledging that his apology won't bring him back. Caroline begins crying, asking why he's telling her all this. Solomon says that they can fix all of this, but he needs her help. He explains that the Foundation has a facility deep underneath Yellowstone containing a lot of machines that can rebuild the world, SCP-2000. It has everything they need, from cloning tanks to a complete backup of the World Wide Web. He needs Caroline to go there, as it has to be activated by a human being. They didn't use the facility earlier as they weren't sure the time was right, since it's a big decision to make. It has to be Caroline, as there's no one left in the Foundation to do it. Caroline refuses, and says that she doesn't want anything to do with this. She just wanted to get married, have a kid or two, and live the rest of her life as an ordinary human, not doing something this important. Solomon pleads with her, saying that it's just a button, but Caroline says it isn't. There are things that man does and there are things that God does, and resetting the entire world isn't something that mankind can go and do by itself. Solomon simply says that they've done it before, although they don't know when, or why, or even how many times. All they know is the facility has been used before, when someone in the past made the decision to abandon their world and everything in it so that mankind could live on. Maybe it was someone from the Foundation, or maybe it was someone like Caroline, but Solomon doesn't think that difference is important. All that matters is that someone looked at that button and asked themselves whether mankind should dare step into the domain of God, and whether they had the right to do this. They asked themselves if humanity would be better off just giving up. But at the end of the day, they pushed that button. He begs her to be that somebody. She again refuses, and Solomon again apologizes, even if his apologies don't mean much. He's sorry that the Foundation failed her, that she lost so much because of their mistakes, and that he has to ask her to do this, but he begs her to help them make things right. Caroline sat and thought about it for a while, thinking of her parents, her friends, and her fiancé. She thought about all the people she knew and all the people she didn't, the world she once lived in, filled with life, and the world as it was now, without green grass and birds singing. It was a world without life, all because some secret organization couldn't keep a few locusts in a cage. She thought about the button, and taking the role of God to save mankind by destroying it. Finally, she sighs and says that she'll try, but can't promise anything. Solomon thanks her, and the rest is history. It is certainly possible, then, that the humanity of the primary timeline already went through the insect hell scenario, and were saved thanks to the actions of a brave individual. Or rather, humanity itself was saved, but the people were not, as SCP-2000 doesn't actually bring people back to life. Either way, it's a fairly terrifying and yet ironic situation. Of all the reality-ending threats in the SCP universe, from godlike entities to galaxy destroyers, the Foundation could finally fail, thanks to a single, anomalous bug. SCP-6002. All creatures, great and small. I've made a couple of videos so far covering various anomalies that are beneficial in different ways to the Foundation or humans in general. Questions often come up on why the Foundation doesn't utilize anomalies more to benefit mankind, and we've even seen entire scenarios play out in which the Foundation does exactly that, with positive results. Generally, though, the Foundation's MO is to secure, contain, and protect, not improve. Sometimes, however, individuals within the Foundation get some bright ideas and do things with the best of intentions but the worst results. Such is the case of SCP-6002. SCP-6002 begins by notifying us that by accessing this file, a Foundation cognito mole will be embedded into our subconscious, allowing them to track all of our movements and biosignature for up to 72 hours. It's a small price to pay, so let's continue. We're then informed that the person accessing this file is a Dr. Rose Wildcat. SCP-6002 is described as a massive organic structure within Klamath National Forest in Northern California. It is similar in appearance to a sequoia tree, but its base has a diameter of 91 meters, and it rises to over 800 meters tall, or around half a mile. Each section of the structure possesses different genetic composition, and similar gene sequences are grouped together in a way resembling the biological tree of life. The tree is broken up into the three domains of life: archaea, bacteria, and eukarya, and further grouped together by kingdom, phylum, and so on. 14% of the genetic samples taken from the tree match currently known organisms, both non-anomalous and anomalous. The rest do not match anything known, believed to represent species currently undiscovered on the planet, and it's further believed that the tree contains the genome of every living thing. That's anomalous enough, but it goes much further than that. Modifying any of the genetic material contained within the tree will proceed to modify every living creature that shares said genetic material simultaneously. As an example, if the genetic material for the sandhill crane was modified in some way within the tree, all living sandhill cranes would experience that change. The repercussions of an anomaly like this are potentially massive, as any significant damage to the tree could drastically alter Earth's ecosystems, especially since humans are represented on the tree as well. What's worse is that since at least 2014, the tree has been severely impacted by an anomalous genetic infection. The origin of this infection is known to the Foundation, but it's been expunged, so we'll get to that later. So far, the infection has done quite a bit of damage to the tree, and thus a number of living creatures, and it's believed that the infection has resulted in the complete loss of at least 56,000 species so far. The Foundation has obviously been very hard at work trying to combat the infection, but it hasn't been easy, or without complications. The only way they've figured out so far to stop it is to completely cut off the infected areas from the tree. This works, of course, but has resulted in the further loss of even more species, a number that the Foundation has removed from the records. Despite cutting away the infected parts, though, the infection continues to return and spread across the tree, and they think that it will reach the section containing humans no later than the year 2100. The tree in its entirety will likely be completely destroyed within 300 years. That brings us to Dr. Wildcat, who leaves a comment on the document saying that when she was in 5th grade, she told her mother that she wanted to be an astronaut. Her mother replied that she is to never leave this planet, as it needs her here. At the time, that pissed her off, but she later realized that it wasn't meant to be a restriction, but rather a vote of confidence from an old Indian mother to her little girl. The Cognito mole chimes in to report that her comment has been recorded and her activity will be monitored, but Rose is fine with that, as she wants the O5s to see her activity, writing that the Master's tools will never dismantle the Master's house. It turns out that Rose is the director of Project 6002 ARC, and we're given an addendum in which she discusses the history and discovery of the tree. The concept of a tree of life appears widely throughout human history, from the tree of life in the Garden of Eden to the Norse Yggdrasil. It was presumed for a while that no connection existed between these various representations, but further analysis has revealed some marked similarities between each of the depictions and SCP-6002, including shape and number of branches, relative trunk and crown sizes, and even locations of deformities. Since it's unlikely that Assyrian artists working on stone carvings in the 9th century BCE had ever seen 6002 or knew of its existence, it's unclear why there are similarities. Art and folklore among native residents of what is now the west coast of the US did, however, directly reference 6002, particularly the Klamath tribes of Northern California. They were aware of 6002 for thousands of years prior to the Foundation's arrival, and may have even understood some of its properties. They at least understood its significance, and established settlements around it. The Foundation gained access to the tree in 1909, and formed a treaty with the Klamath tribes to study it. The treaty was soon broken, though, and the Foundation quickly acquired the land surrounding the tree, killing off most of the individuals in the area, and amnesticizing the rest through highly dubious methods, largely lobotomization. Every settlement near the tree was burned to the ground, and the Foundation later destroyed its own containment records concerning the event in order to sweep it under the rug. We do, however, have the results of their initial tests on the tree, starting in November of 1910, led by Dr. Manfred. They created a provisional site at the base of the tree's crown, where the branches begin, so that researchers could spend multiple days in the tree without descending. The tree proved to produce new growths at an alarming rate, with Manfred turning his back on a ladder for a few minutes, only to look back and find it totally grown over. However, much of this growth withers away just as quickly, and Manfred wonders what decides if a new twig stays or goes. Later, Manfred and his team were walking down a branch about 20 minutes from their camp when they heard a tremendous sound, described as rupturing, echoing, and inhuman, like a soul on the racks of hell. A moment later, an enormous branch, about 200 feet long, withered off the tree near them and fell to the ground. When they examined the spot where the branch had been, they found that there was no sign of breakage, but just smooth wood, as if the branch had never been there. They decided from then on to always be attached to the main trunk with a rope and harness. Manfred later writes that he remains unconvinced that this is actually a tree at all. When you touch parts of it, it doesn't feel like wood, and you'd swear that you're brushing up against fur, or scales, or skin. And then there's the noises, as the wind through the branches sounds more like howling than anything else. In September of 1914, they would get their first big clue about the nature of the tree, as the last known instance of the passenger pigeon died in captivity in the Cincinnati Zoo. At the same time, the tree shed a large branch, and Dr. Manfred hypothesizes a link between the two events. The Foundation continued to gain a further understanding of gene sequencing, and by 1922, Manfred confirmed that the branch that was shed contained passenger pigeon genetic material. Things would then get really interesting in 1924, as we're given a few more journal excerpts. Manfred and another scientist had been working all afternoon on a branch, and they were ready to descend when Manfred lost his footing. As soon as he felt himself slip, he reached out for a smaller branch just above him. As the branch was a newer growth, it snapped right off, leaving only his harness to save him. The other scientist scolded him over it, but he told her to look at it as an opportunity, since they've never removed a living branch before. The ones that they've studied had fallen off themselves, and had dried up before they hit the ground. He also writes that he could have sworn that he heard another sound when the branch broke off, something higher pitched, like a yelp. 2 days later, Manfred believes he has a genetic match for the branch, the domestic dog. Specifically, a small hunting breed that had been growing in popularity, the Manhattan Terrier. Manfred is fond of the dogs, saying that there was a whole pack of them on the next farm over when he was a boy, and they loved to chase squirrels. He's glad that this wasn't an extinction event, as he's not sure how he'd break it to the team, and at the speed at which the tree grows, the branch is probably back already. Unfortunately, a week later, Manfred writes that the other scientist started crying when the news came in, and she hasn't stopped. He's trying to keep a brave face for the rest of them, but he hopes that God will forgive him for what he did. Following the branch breaking off, Manhattan Terriers experienced a mass die-off across the world, with previously healthy instances suffering cardiac arrests, strokes, and other ailments. Females became unable to produce viable offspring, and by February of 1926, the entire breed is declared extinct. The Foundation proceeds to engage in a widespread disinformation campaign to expunge records and memories of the Manhattan Terrier, and is considered successful on November 4th, 1929. Following the incident, Manfred updates the containment procedures to ban all experimentation on the tree, and to limit ascent to personnel trained in climbing equipment. Dr. Wildcat leaves a comment saying that she's never heard of the Manhattan Terrier, and that even back then, the Foundation's greatest strength was escaping accountability when it messed up. She at least commends Manfred for banning testing on the tree, and writes that if he's listening from the afterlife, to not be too hard on himself. One species gone isn't that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. Manfred's ban on experimentation would last for quite a number of years, but in 1989, a new research team was appointed with the goal of entirely mapping out the tree, led by a Dr. Muller, with Dr. Wildcat as a junior researcher. They oversaw a research team consisting of several hundred personnel, and they did end up successfully mapping out the genome before the end of the century. In March of 2002, Dr. Muller proposed initial testing of genetic modification.
Don't mean to interrupt this, but this is gonna go on for like another half an hour, and I think I'm pretty much done for the night, so I don't know how long I've been streaming for, but yeah, I'm just gonna cut it early. But hey, I learned a cool new technique that little, I don't know if you saw me doing it, but it was like that tracing thing I was doing. So yeah, I mean, I don't really need to explain it. If you've been watching me, then you pretty much know what I've been doing. But it makes this cool effect. Like honestly, I didn't think it would turn out so well. But yeah, that's it. I'm gonna end the stream. If you want to listen to the rest of this little spooky story, then I put a link in the comment section. You can just look up the Exploring series, SCP, and this one in particular was called SCP-6002, All Creatures Great and Small. So yeah, I don't know if you were listening to that and into it, and I kind of cut it off early, but yeah, I definitely recommend that channel, the Exploring series. It's probably the best way to get into the SCP series, but I'm not, yeah, I don't mean to ramble, but okay, I think I'm just gonna end it here. That's it. I'm done. I'm tired. I'm gonna end it. So yeah, thanks for watching, and like always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me during the stream or after the stream. Doesn't matter. But yeah, I feel like I'm making good progress with this. So let's see if I can continue this tomorrow, and yeah, we'll just take it a day at a time and see what happens. Yeah, I'm gonna end it here. So thanks for watching. For like the fourth time, I'm gonna say that, but yeah, I really mean it. I'll see you next time.